We are in the Cryosphere pavilion, and I'm Joseph. Now we will have a presentation of Sarah Lees, who is a PhD fellow from the University of Copenhagen, and she will present the subglacial methane emissions in Greenland. So thank you very much, Sarah, for being here. And
thank you very much, Joseph. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm a physical geographer, and I'm about to finish my PhD at the University of Copenhagen. And today I want to bring you into a fascinating yet largely hidden world, a world beneath the ice that holds a surprising climate secret. So let me bring you to a place where I've spent many weeks over the last 3 summers. This is the surface of the Greenland Ice Sheet, right at the margin, close to the town of Kangerlussuaq. Here we're walking only a few hundred meters away from the ice edge and from the non-vegetated tundra area. And what we've been doing while being filmed here was to study the surface hydrology of the ice sheet and how this beautiful blue meltwater glacier is connected to the glacier portal. In order to do so, we pour fluorescent pink dye into the water on the surface, and we can measure its return once it comes out from the glacier portal. So through this experiment, we found out that the meltwater coming from the glacier surface takes 10 minutes until it reaches the portal. But what's quite interesting is there's much more water coming out of the glacier portal than what we saw on the ice sheet surface. And also this meltwater is highly concentrated in methane. Methane, as you know, is a greenhouse gas that is much more potent than CO2 over the period of a century. And the fact that it was recently discovered only a few years ago that it's coming out from underneath ice sheets is very interesting and important information, and it could have implications for our future climate measures. So in my research over the last years, I've been investigating how this subglacial methane is being produced, how it is transported from the subglacial environment into the atmosphere, and how best to study it. It's a very new field of research. It's very exciting and it's rapidly evolving. And I'm thrilled to share some of the insights we've uncovered. So in order to understand what's going on, I drew a sketch here of what we have seen in the video. So we have the 3 researchers on the glacier surface. We have the surface meltwater and this beautiful blue meltwater pond. So the surface meltwater that is generated during the summer melt season, it flows along the glacier surface until it dips into the ice and eventually comes out of the meltwater port. But in order to understand where all the other meltwater that's coming out of the glacier portal is coming from, we actually have to venture further up onto the ice. Because the surface doesn't only melt at the ice margin, but also hundreds of kilometers up onto the ice sheet. And due to our warming climate, this glacier melt is happening at increasingly higher distances from the glacier margin. So at hundreds of kilometers from the ice sheet margin, surface meltwater is being generated, which flows along the surface until it finds small cracks in the ice. It soon winds these cracks into large channels and flows through the ice until it reaches the glacier bed. Then it travels along the bed until the meltwater port. The ice far up on the ice sheet, it's hundreds of meters thick. And due to this thickness, it exhibits a high pressure on the underlying sediments. The pressure is actually so high that the meltwater at the bottommost, that the ice of the bottommost layers is melting, and subglacial meltwater it's being generated, which slowly flows along the glacier bed until it also exits from the meltwater portal. So all this ice, it is sitting on land. And if you imagine this land, what does it look like and what does it feel like? So first of all, it feels very cold. Cold, but it's not frozen, and therefore we have liquid water flowing along the glacier bed. Also, we would be quite out of breath because there is no oxygen. It is dark, we wouldn't see anything. So if we turn on the light, we will notice that there is lots of big boulders, small rocks, gravel, interspersed with a lot of fine sediment. If we analyze the sediment, then we find a lot of organic material in there. And this organic material, it's all dead, it is ancient. And it comes from a time when the climate was warmer and when there was vegetation growing in this part of Greenland. There were lakes where organic material could be deposited, and there were who knows what else roaming this land, which is now all hidden underneath the ice. Another thing we find when we analyze the sediments is there's lots of life in the form of microbes. And these microbes are called methanogens. They use the ancient organic material to produce energy, and as a byproduct of this process, methane is being generated. So a lot of this methane generated at the glacier bed, it doesn't stay there, but it is being diffused and dissolved into the subglacial meltwater, from where it then is transported to the glacier portal and diffuses to the atmosphere. As soon as the meltwater is in contact with the atmosphere, it diffuses because the concentrations in the meltwater are so high, making the subglacial environment a direct source of methane emissions to the atmosphere. So how do we research processes going on underneath the ice? We could drill through the ice, but that is immensely expensive and it's quite unpredictable which areas you will reach. What we do is we study the meltwater on the glacier surface. We study the meltwater coming out underneath the portal in order to gain information about this big black box that is the subglacial environment. Let me introduce you to what this field work looks like. So we aim to go to the sides as soon as the meltwater starts flowing, which can be any time in May or in June, and we set up a measurement station at the glacier portal. So we get our instruments into the water and we secure them very well because, as you can imagine, in these turbulent meltwater rivers, they can be flushed away and destroyed quite easily. Then we aim to measure the concentration in the meltwater over an entire season. And the conventionally available instruments that can measure dissolved methane in meltwater, they are prohibitively expensive, and they would also require people to remain in the field for many months on end. So that is why we've developed our own custom-made, low-cost, low-power sensor solution, which can measure independently, continuously over a long time, and allows us to also conduct field work in other locations every summer. So whatever we find of the methane in the water, it's only what still remains in the water. Because some of it has already degassed into the atmosphere, even inside the glacier. So in order to account for how much has already been lost from the water, we measure the methane concentration underneath the ice. And how we do this is we insert a long pole underneath the ice at the glacier portal. There is a tube attached to the pole which draws the air out from underneath the ice towards a portable greenhouse gas analyzer, which is the yellow box here. And that one can measure methane and CO2 concentrations in field time. The last thing that we do in the field is we also collect meltwater to study its hydrochemistry, which tells us a lot about the flow paths the water has taken. And we collect methane samples to then later analyze them in the laboratory regarding their source based on the isotopic signature and also their age. So let me tell you some of the key findings and some of the key numbers. The current methane concentration in the atmosphere are 1.9 ppm. ppm means parts per million. So if you have a million air molecules, then 1.9 of those are methane. It sounds very little, but since methane is such a potent greenhouse gas, even a small increase in this number can have very dramatic consequences for our climate. In the water at the glacier, at the surface of the glacier, we measure 4.9 nanomoles of methane, which is equivalent to those 1.9 ppm just dissolved in the water. But then it becomes interesting because at the glacier portal, we measure methane concentrations between 250 to 7,400 nanomoles, which is 1,500 times the atmospheric concentration. And that is only what still remains in the water because a lot of it has already degassed into the atmosphere inside the glacier portal, where we have measured incredible concentrations of up to 700 ppm or 370 times the atmospheric concentration. Over the last 3 summers, we managed to collect an entire melt season of data of dissolved methane concentrations at the glacier portal. And this data is very interesting because it shows the high variability of concentrations in the water. So in the beginning of the season, we measured the highest concentrations, which is likely due to an overwinter buildup of methane underneath the ice, which is being flushed out by the first meltwater peaks. And then the concentrations are decreasing over the season, likely due to dilution from the input of the surface meltwater, which has atmospheric methane concentrations. So this data shows that there is a very strong link between methane concentrations and meltwater volumes and meltwater dynamics. And it's also very interesting because it highlights the need for continuous and long-term measurements. Just imagine you go there early in the season, you take one spot sample, which has a very high concentration, and you use that information to calculate a seasonal methane concentration or methane budget. You would be highly overestimating what is coming out of this one glacier portal. The same if you go there late in the season when the concentrations are very low, you would be underestimating what is actually going on. Everything I've shown you so far is from Isungwat-Sermia, an outlet glacier in Western Greenland. And this outlet, if you're familiar with glacial outlets, it is tiny in size compared to some of the major glaciers and major meltwater rivers. But it is a great site to study the processes and to develop the instruments, because this is not the only site where it is happening. So when I first started my PhD in 2021, we knew that there are 5 sites of subglacial meltwater portals, which are sites of direct methane emissions to the atmosphere. 4 of those are located in southern Greenland, and 1 is in Iceland. And over the last few years, there has been a lot of interest in this topic. Many more research groups have gone on the hunt to find out where else these methane emissions are occurring, and we could draw many more points onto the map. So now we, for example, know that there is a glacier in China where methane is being produced under the ice and exported to the atmosphere. We have such glaciers in Alaska. There are many more along the entire western margin of the Greenland Ice Sheet. A project I've been part of in the Alps, we found elevated methane concentrations in the meltwater in about half of the 27 glaciers that we researched. And a very interesting project I did in the Yukon, in the Kuana National Park, where I randomly picked 3 glaciers to study, not expecting to find any methane in the meltwater there actually. And it turned out that there were highly elevated methane concentrations in all of them, between 45 to 250 times higher than the atmospheric concentration. What all these studies show collectively is that this phenomenon is much more widespread than we initially thought, and that it is not exclusive to the large ice sheet in Greenland, but it's also happening underneath much smaller mountain glaciers. So what does all this information mean in a global sense? The subglacial methane, it contributes to the global methane budget, which is a part of the overall carbon budget. But the research of this very new field of study, it's not advanced enough that it is being accounted for in any methane emission budgets or in climate laws. So the subglacial methane, so what we see here, it is the global methane budget with the anthropogenic, the human-made methane emissions in orange, the natural methane emissions in green, and the natural sinks also in green. The subglacial methane emissions, they would contribute somewhere here in the wetland group because of its very similar isotopic signature. However, as I said, we currently don't have any estimates of how big this contribution is, nor how it will develop in the future. But what we do know is that while these natural sources contain a lot of uncertainty, we know where most of the methane is coming from, and that is from anthropogenic sources, such as agriculture and waste disposal, or the fossil fuel production and its use. And that is where we have the power and the responsibility to act decisively in reducing emissions and in mitigating climate change. So there are many open questions in this field of research. Thank you. There are many remaining open questions in this field of research, of which, in my opinion, the 3 most important ones to tackle are: where else do subglacial methane emissions occur? As I said, in only 3 years, we have found many more places where this phenomenon is happening. 11% of the Earth's surface are covered by ice. So what's the proportion of this area that contains the right conditions, meaning anoxic and anoxic environments, organic material, and methanogens, so the microbes, that there is methane being produced and then flushed out from underneath the ice. Another very important question is what this contribution is for the global methane budget. So in order to have more information to answer this question, we need to find out where is it happening and how much is coming out from all of these glacier portals. And finally, how will subglacial methane emissions develop in the future under a warming climate and under higher melt conditions? Will they decrease because the methane is being flushed out from underneath the ice and the source is eventually depleted? Or will they increase because there is more meltwater reaching the bed of the glacier in areas which have not been connected to surface meltwater yet, and a lot of the methane stored there will be flushed out? So this presentation, it's just one example of the excellent work being done by early career scientists in their own fields. And the discovery of subglacial methane, it is a reminder of how much remains hidden beneath the surface. Research like ours, it emphasizes the urgent need for a conservative approach to climate policy. Because if we act only on what we currently understand, then we run the risk of being blindsided by all the things we have to yet fully comprehend. And processes that could accelerate climate change in ways that we are not prepared for. So therefore, my take-home message from this presentation for you is this. And we already know a great deal about our climate system and its interactions and the cryosphere, but we certainly don't know everything yet. And there is likely so much that we are yet to discover, and it is essential to plan for these unknowns. Therefore, I urge the negotiators here to take a cautious and conservative approach that accounts for all the complexities and surprises that young researchers like myself are still working to untangle. Thank you very much. So I'm happy to take questions. Yes, please.
So I have a couple of questions.
Yes.
So the first one is, what happens to the methane when it washes out into the ocean? Some of it's, decomposed in situ, right, in the ocean. So what does it out there? So do you have an idea of how much of this methane comes out in the water and ends up harmful?
Exactly. So you're referring to land terminating glaciers where the meltwater flows into the ocean water. That's a very interesting question because it just hasn't been researched. So my guess would be that a lot of that will be oxidized within the water column and then transformed, like you said correctly, into CO2, still making it a source of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, but a much less potent one. Yes, we're doing both. So we are measuring it in the meltwater, which is the means of transportation of the methane coming out from underneath the ice. But we also measure it in the air, still inside the glacier portal, because as soon as the meltwater is in contact with air, the methane immediately degasses into the atmospheric headspace because the concentration in the water is so high. They're from both. So no, they're going to be different. So what we saw in this, the numbers I presented, we had higher concentrations in the water and lower concentrations in the air. But that really changes from day to day, and it completely depends on the morphology of the glacier portal and the volume of the headspace. So let's say we have very little meltwater in the channel and a large headspace, then much more methane can already diffuse into the air and will have higher concentrations in the air than in the water, and vice versa. It's always zero. So the water, that's why it's very convenient also for sensors, which are temperature dependent, to work in this setting, because over a melt season, the temperature variation is between 0.0 and 0.1. So it's essentially not there.
Can we go back to the slide where you showed the time series of the people in orange?
You mean the global methane bucket?
The time series. Yeah. So
Yeah.
around July 23, there's like it looks like daily spikes.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Is that it? Because July in Greenland, where there's it's not really like a daily weather. It's not just what's going on.
It is, but in the hydrology, we still see a 24-hour cycle in meltwater volumes. And that's exactly what also influences the concentration. So if we would zoom into this graph, as soon as the subglacial meltwater system is developed and we have very efficient and fast flowing through meltwater, then we see those diurnal patterns in the meltwater volumes and also in the methane concentrations, which are not completely in sync. And it also changes throughout the season, which just shows of how many different processes play into what influences the methane concentration we are measuring. So part of it is the volume of the meltwater flowing through, but parts of it also is the source of methane depleted, are new sources being reached by the water. How much already degasses into the air. But as you said very correctly, we do have diurnal patterns in the concentration of the methane, just as we have in the volume of the meltwater. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. So this is what we call, it's a warm-based glacier, meaning that there is water in its liquid state at the glacier bed throughout the year. Because the pressure of the overlying ice is so high that it doesn't freeze. So also in winter, we have liquid water there, which allows the process of methane generation and the dissolution into the water, meaning that throughout the winter, there is likely a lot of methane being produced, which doesn't get flushed out in such large quantities. And that is why I think we see the spike in the early melt season. That is methane, which is being generated during winter, stored there, and then as soon as it is connected to the meltwater, it is being flushed out. So in winter, we actually at the site, we do see that there is still meltwater flowing out of the glacier because there is a subglacial icing form. So there is a large mass of ice forming in front of the glacier, which can only be coming from meltwater flowing out continuously. Yeah.
Last question.
Yes.
Is there a distinct isotopic signature? If so, can you measure the? Can you just answer the question like about how much of it comes from the marine environment? So,
oh, you mean in the case of a marine terminating glacier, if you look at the isotopic signature?
Yeah.
And how much is coming from, just that I understand it correctly, how much is?
Can you detect from the subglacial?
Yes, absolutely. That's how we know that it is microbial methane, because we also tested it for other sources. It could be thermogenic methane, so coming from deep regions of the lithosphere, and it could also be from methane clathrates, so like crystallized methane underneath the ice sheet, but it is microbial methane because the isotopic signature of different methane sources, it is very distinct. Yeah, so that is how in the global methane budget, for example, we can also distinguish the anthropogenic sources, natural wetland sources, because they all have their own fingerprint when it comes to the isotopic composition.